Hello, welcome back to part 2 of lecture 19 on the female reproductive system. This lecture is going to cover the internal and external accessory organs of the female, and once again this material is from chapter 27 in Marab. So we're going to begin with several internal accessory organs, and then we'll cover the external accessory organs. The ones we're going to be talking about here, as you see in this pelvic sagittal section, include the uterine tube, which is also the fallopian tube as we mentioned, the uterus, and the vagina. Let's first talk about the uterine or fallopian tubes. These are the tubes, of course, that connect the ovaries to the uterus, and the tubes have several anatomical segments as you see on the right. The first segment is known as the infundibulum, and you see that here. This is the end that's basically closest to the ovary. You'll notice these finger-like projections on the end of the infundibulum. These are basically projections that cover the surface of the ovary so that an egg that's being ovulated will be taken up. Now the inner surfaces of the fimbriae and this portion of the uterine tube have cilia that basically beat toward the center, and what that does is create fluid currents that basically drive the fluid this way so that an egg that's ovulated from the ovary has more of a tendency to go into the uterine tube rather than lodge someplace else. The middle segment of the uterine tube is known as the ampulla, and this is typically the segment where fertilization will take place, about the middle or so of the tube. And the final segment is known as the isthmus, and you'll notice the isthmus is the connecting segment of the fallopian tube to the uterus here. Now the transport of oocytes are facilitated two different ways through the tube. One is by the ciliary action that I just mentioned before. This is from the cilia that beat in the infundibulum of the fallopian tubes. This sets up the fluid currents that I mentioned before. And also by peristalsis. The tube is surrounded by smooth muscle, and around the time of ovulation, or just a few hours before ovulation, what happens is the smooth muscle begins contracting and will actually begin carrying out peristaltic contractions that will lead the egg toward the uterus. Now the root word for fallopian tube, as you see here, is salpinx. The adjectival form for that is salping or salpingo. So for example, a removal of the uterine tubes would be a salpingectomy. You'll also notice on top here it takes about 4 days for an oocyte to travel from the infundibulum down into the uterine cavity. So from the time the oocyte's released from the ovary to the time it makes it down to the uterine cavity is typically about 4 days. Now, as I mentioned before, and as we'll see later on, the fertilization typically takes place in the midpoint of the tube, and what happens is during those several days from the time the fertilization takes place until implantation, the egg is continually dividing and developing as it moves down into the body of the uterus. If we look at the lining of the uterine tube, you can see a couple of things that we've already talked about. Notice that we can see the cilia which beat and create the fluid currents that drive the egg into the fallopian tube from the ovary. The second thing we can see is that the cells that line the fallopian tubes are tall columnar cells that basically secrete glycoproteins and lipids. These are going to provide nutrition to the developing fertilized egg until it makes it down to the uterus and can begin establishing its own placenta to get nutrients from the uterus itself. The second internal accessory organ of the female we want to talk about is the uterus. Notice the root word for uterus is hyster or hystero. Now there are several parts anatomically of the uterus. I'm outlining the uterus here in red, and you can see that this is basically an upside down pear-shaped organ in the human female. Pretty large organ. A very muscular layer in the middle that we're going to talk about in a little while. Let's talk about the major anatomical portions of this. The first is the fundus, and as we've seen several times in the course, this is the portion of a hollow organ furthest away from the exit. And in this case, the exit is the cervix, which is here. So the fundus of the uterus lies up here. The second portion, which is the body of the uterus, is located down past the fundus, down to right about where this constriction is. So this whole area right in here is the body of the uterus. And then finally, right where the constriction is, right about here, begins the cervix. So all this portion of the uterus right here is the cervix, and you notice that the end of the cervix projects into the upper end of the vagina. Now, in the cervix, we have an internal opening right here that's known as an internal cervical os, and an os down here that opens into the upper portion of the vagina. This is known as the external orifice, sometimes also just known as the external cervical os. Os just means mouth. And as you can see, the internal os and the external os are connected by the cervical canal, which is right here. Now, there are several layers to the uterus as well. The outer layer, as we mentioned before, is a layer of the peritoneum, which is known as the perimetrium. So this is the outer layer that we see here. The middle muscular layer of the uterus is known as the myometrium, myo meaning muscle, and that is smooth muscle. And then finally, the inner layer is known as the endometrium. The endometrium is the lining into which the fertilized egg will eventually plant. Now, the endometrium, as we'll see in a couple of minutes, is also shed at menses if there's not a fertilized egg present or implanted. The uterus, as you see on the left, has several functions. It protects the fetus mechanically during the growth of the embryo and the fetus because of the thick muscular wall that we have. It also provides nutritional support for the fetus. This is by way of the placenta that gets established within the endometrium. It also provides for waste removal from the fetus, and this is comparable to the nutritional support just the other way. In other words, taking wastes away from the fetus and letting the mother process those wastes. This is also via the placenta. And finally, at parturition or at birth, the smooth muscle of the uterus in the myometrium functions to eject the fetus down through the birth canal, which is the vagina. Now, in this diagram, you'll see a cross-section of the uterine wall. Notice the smooth muscle that goes from here to here. So there's a very thick smooth muscle wall. You'll notice that the smooth muscle runs in several different directions: longitudinal, circular, and oblique. The outer layer, as we mentioned before, is here. This would be the perimetrium. And then the inner layer, which is the endometrium, you'll notice here actually consists of two separate layers that have two different functions. The inner layer that I have right in here, that I have the line over, is basically the part of the uterine lining that stays in place and doesn't get sloughed off with menses. The other part of this, which is right here under the angle bracket, is the part that grows in depth during part of the menstrual cycle and also is shed at menses. So only this outer portion is shed at menses, and it's the outer portion here into which the fertilized egg will implant and will basically form the placenta in this layer of the uterus. You'll also notice some of the uterine blood supply. We have a uterine artery that supplies the uterus with blood, and these arteries that go in this way are known as radial arteries. And then we also have arcuate arteries similar to those that we saw in the kidney that curve around this way. Now, the arteries that actually supply the endometrium itself, as you see here, are branches of the radial arteries, and these actually form what we call spiral arteries in this layer of the endometrium that develops and then is sloughed off at menses, as we said. The last internal reproductive structure of the female that we want to talk about is the vagina. The main functions of the vagina are passageway for elimination of menstrual fluids. So when the endometrium is shed at menses, it will come out through the cervix and then proceed out through the vagina into the vestibule. It also, of course, receives the penis and holds sperm prior to passage in the uterus. And it also forms the birth canal for fetal delivery. So when the fetus is ready to be delivered and the smooth muscle begins contracting, it comes down once again through the cervix and then through the vagina. You can appreciate, I think, that the vagina is an expandable muscular tube, so it has a lot of elastic tissue in it, so it can accommodate quite a bit of stretching during birth or parturition. You'll notice some of the blood supply of the vagina is via the vaginal arteries that are here. These play an important role in lubrication of the vagina during sexual arousal of the female. What happens is some of the blood plasma that's coming into the vagina is actually squeezed through the lining and enters here and serves as a lubricant, in fact the main lubricant for the vagina during sexual activity. You'll also notice that the vagina has rugae, very similar to those rugae that we saw in the stomach, in the sense that when sexual excitation occurs, as we'll see in a little while, the vagina elongates and expands, and the rugae will actually flatten out a little bit. However, some of the rugae do remain, and this serves as more or less a friction between the penis and the vagina. One thing of note is that the vagina of an adult female is acidic, and I think we talked about that before, and that's one of the major reasons why seminal fluid is so important, because its alkaline nature offsets that acidity and protects the sperm from any harmful effects. So the acidity of the vagina is actually here to protect adult females from bacterial infections. It provides a much less favorable environment for colonization by things that don't belong there. Different species of bacteria, fungi, for example. This is not so, though, in prepubescent girls. In prepubescent girls, the cellular nature of the cells that line the mucosa of the vagina is different. They don't produce the glycogen, and so there's really no bacterial action that creates the acidity, primarily from lactobacillus type bacteria. And this is not present in the prepubescent female. Now let's turn our attention to the external reproductive organs of the female, and you'll see that these are included in a structure that's known as the vulva. An older term, kind of holdover term for the female external genitalia is pudendum. People tend not to use this anymore because the original meaning of the term pudendum was shameful. This is when men were in charge, I guess. Nowadays we tend to use the term vulva for the female external genitalia. And as you see, this includes several structures that are external to the vagina. First of all, starting from the most anterior portion, you'll notice we have the mons pubis. This is a large mound of hair-covered flesh that's in front of the pubic bone, and this is somewhat for protection of the pubic bone during sexual intercourse. We also, moving down toward the posterior, you'll notice that we have the clitoris here, which is heavily invested with sensory nerves. The glands of the clitoris that we see here is actually analogous to the glands of the penis. This arises from the same embryonic type tissue. Also notice that there's a prepuce to the clitoris, just as there was a prepuce to the glands of the penis. So this is a hood that covers the clitoris, as you see here. Now, moving down from this, you'll notice a couple of structures that we talked about before. These are the labia minora. These are the very thin skin, hairless lips that surround the opening that's here, and that entire opening is known as the vestibule. So you'll see that the urethra and the vagina both open into the vestibule, as do the greater vestibular glands, which are also called Bartholin's glands, and their location is down here. And these glands are important for you to be aware of because they're pretty large glands, as I'll show you in the next slide, and they also have a tendency to become infected. So there could be a Bartholinitis. Sometimes these develop into cysts, which are Bartholin cysts. Now, outside the labia minora, we have the labia majora, which are very thick, hair-covered lips that surround the entire outer structure of the female reproductive organs. Now, the vaginal opening itself, right here, the vaginal entrance, is sometimes known as the vaginal introitus. And you notice what they're illustrating here is a hymen that's been torn. Now, a hymen, before it's torn, basically covers the vaginal introitus. Before a girl has reached puberty, the skin will cover this opening. It can be destroyed and opened either by sexual activity, by the insertion of tampons perhaps, even by strenuous physical activity such as athletics in young girls. So there are several different things that can tear the hymen. The hymen does need to be opened before the first menstrual period so that the menstrual fluids can leave the vagina. Now, the other thing I want to mention here is the dashed diamond-shaped area. The triangle that surrounds the genital structures here, the external reproductive structures, this one up here is known as a urogenital triangle. The one that surrounds the anal region is known as the anal triangle. Together, these two triangles make an area that's known as the perineum. And in some books, the perineum is restricted to this little thin raphe that connects basically the vaginal fourchette down here to the anus, but most people refer to the entire diamond-shaped area that we have here as the perineum. Now, in this next slide, you'll see a view where we can look at some of the deeper structures. A couple of things we've already seen. Notice the glands of the clitoris once again right here. As we said, this is analogous to the glands of the penis. And notice the crus of the clitoris right here. These are bound to the pelvic wall, just as the crus of the penis was bound to the pelvic wall, as we saw in the males. So these structures are very analogous to the male structures. Moving down a little bit, we can see the urethral orifice right here, the urethral meatus. On the sides of the urethra, as we mentioned before, remember we have paraurethral glands. These are sometimes called lesser vestibular glands and also called Skene's glands, as I mentioned before. These would be analogous actually to the male prostate gland. Surrounding the vaginal walls, you'll notice the vestibular bulbs. These are large structures that will fill with blood during sexual arousal in the female, and these basically serve to increase the amount of friction that the vaginal walls will exert on the penis when it's inserted. And finally, down the bottom, you can see how large the greater vestibular glands are. These are the Bartholin's glands that I mentioned before. And finally, let's talk about erection, lubrication, and orgasm in the female. The autonomic nervous system branches that control the erection, lubrication, are basically the same as those that control erection in the male. And remember, that is the parasympathetic nervous system. As we talked about in the male, the parasympathetic nerves release nitric oxide, which is a blood vessel relaxer and causes blood to flow into all the erectile tissues. And you'll see that here, this includes the vagina, which, as we mentioned before, expands and elongates. It also causes several other things like the vestibular glands to increase in size, being filled with blood. They also begin to secrete mucus. The Bartholin's glands secrete mucus. These are equivalent to the bulbourethral glands that are in the male, so these also serve to ease the entry of the penis into the vagina. And as we talked about in the male, remember that the sympathetic nervous system was what controlled ejaculation in the male and orgasm. So orgasm results in rhythmic contractions in the muscles of the perineum, the walls of the uterus, as well as the uterine tubes. So this is very important because when sperm is deposited into the female reproductive tract, the rhythmic contractions and the peristalsis that occurs throughout the female reproductive tract tends to move the sperm up toward the uterus and up toward the fallopian tubes where fertilization might take place. Okay, so that finishes off Lecture 19, Part 2. The last lecture of the course is going to be Lecture 20, and I'll see you very shortly for that.